I'm very happy today to welcome Dr. Ross MacPhee, Director of Science at Rewilding America Now and Curator of Vertebrate Zoology Emeritus at the American Museum of Natural History. Thank you so much for coming on and being willing to talk to me today.
It's a great pleasure, Carol.
I, um, I think it's very important to understand the history of horses so that we can better understand what we might do to help wild horses in the future. So I wanted to ask you some questions about how horses evolved and how that's significant. So I thought I'd ask, when did horses evolve and how long did they exist in North America?
Okay, that's actually a very complex question, but I'll try and answer it efficiently. Let's start with the definition of horse. Now, we all know what a domestic horse looks like, but the further you go back in time, the less the relatives, the earlier antecedents of the modern horse look like today's horse. So let me do it this way. The family equity, which includes horses and all of their relatives, started about 50 million years ago, give or take. Started with something very famous called the dawn horse. Some of you may have heard of that particular expression. The dawn horse was the size of a large cat, lived in the forest, had a diet that was nothing like that of modern horses, and survived, nevertheless, comparatively well for a long period of time. Thereafter, because the horse group was very successful. And again, we think of horses as they are today. So they're committed grazers. They live in certain places and not others. You'd never think of horses as being tropical forest dwellers, for example. So we have to bear in mind that you need to have kind of a broad view of what an equid is like for the rest of what I'm going to say. Horses were probably browsers, fruit eaters, that kind of thing for a very large part of their history. So that already tells you that they were not living in places that we would ordinarily associate with horses today. And there's a very good reason for that. There weren't any grasslands. The grasslands that we have today are a comparatively recent innovation, evolutionarily speaking. They came in to begin with about 20 million years ago, and since then, of course, have spread enormously over the face of the planet. Now, that's actually a very important thing. It sounds like I'm wandering from Carol's question, but what made horses was the grasslands. And what the grasslands get in turn is that horses and other large herbivores make them. So it's a tight circle and a very important one when we get to questions of horse conservation and so forth, as I know we will. Anyway, I want to go just back to this theme for one more second. With the appearance of grasslands, this was a major new niche for herbivores of all sorts. And you only have to consider the other big family of ungulates that we all know about, the bovidae, which includes the cattle family. They took up grazing just like uh, horse relatives did. And when you think about the grasslands that we have today, and let's choose a place that's not North America, let's think of Southern Africa. The grasslands there are inhabited by a wide variety of bovids, but an enormous number, relatively speaking, of horse relatives. I'm talking about zebras. There's at least 4 species. There's more depending on viewpoint, but there's a lot of them. And the thing about this is that it gives us kind of a perspective on what the past might have been like, with multiple species of equids in what we might consider one place. And that's going to be important for discussing another aspect of horse evolution. Anyway, the horse that we recognize as the horse today appeared about 1.8 million years ago, appeared in North America. About that, there is no question. But there were probably also other species of equids at the same time. And that is the basis for a lot of complex hand wringing and worrying about whether or not we can consider horses native. Because how would we know? If all we have is paleontology, how would we really know what their relationship was to one another?
Okay. And why is it significant that the horses crossed back and forth across the Bering Land Bridge?
Wasn't just horses, it was a lot of horse relatives as well over the last 50 million years. The Bering Land Bridge has come and gone a lot over time. It's actually continental rocks, so it's the same kind of rocks that we're standing or sitting on right now. The difference is that there's uh, a downlift, and the end result of that is that when sea level is high, the land bridge is swamped. But when it's low, it's exposed. It was frequently exposed during the ice ages over the last 3 million years, the ice ages. And during that time, there were big exchanges. Horses, yes, but also a lot of the other animals that we would regard as being typical of North America right now. Let's just name some of them. Moose arose in Asia, came over to North America. It's in both places now. Muskox, another great example. Caribou, it goes on. I don't want to keep going on the list. What I want to make it very clear is that it was a wide highway, and lots of species took advantage of it, going in one direction or the other. The reason why we have horses now, domestic horses, is because although there was an extinction in North America that wiped them all out, and wiped out a lot of them in Asia too, I might add, there were obviously pockets where they survived. And when it was sorted out by humans that horses were good for something other than hunting and eating, namely as vehicles, transportation, what have you, about 6,000 years ago, that made all the difference. That's why we still have horses all over the world. It's thanks to us taking them all over the world.
And so the recent studies that show that horses existed in North America up to 5,000 years ago, is it is it possible that they didn't completely die out here?
Well, we have to go back to this point that I was making about multiple species being around at one time. At one point, until fairly recently, I was convinced that the direct antecedents of domestic horses, just like we have today, existed at least up until 10,000 years ago in North America. Now, why would I think such a thing? Well, it's because it's my job to make inferences about relationships based on really crappy material, which is what paleontology is mostly about. And if you take a look at the kinds of structures that we ordinarily look at as paleontologists to make our assessments, it's things like teeth. Teeth are, in fact, very instructive about relationships most of the time. They can be misleading and they can be insufficiently precise. All of that's true. But if you take a look at a Pleistocene horse, at least some of them, and a modern domestic horse, it would be hard pressed. You would be hard pressed to tell the difference. That doesn't mean that paleontologists do not make a difference. They certainly do. And that's why we have something upward of 60 species named for the Pleistocene of North America, which is ridiculous. There's no way that there was that many species at any one time. In any case, to go back to Carol's question, the evidence recently, two kinds of evidence. One is for very late survival, comparatively late survival up until maybe 6,000 years ago in Yukon and northern Canada, and probably in the northern tier of North America generally, although we don't have that evidence yet, suggested, yes, they hung on. They hung on longer than anyone thought. The other side of the coin, however, is the evidence of DNA. There was a very good, very exhaustive study published a couple of years ago by Ludovic Orlando and his collaborators. And they were interested absolutely interested in whether there was any real evidence for Equus caballus, which is the species we're talking about for the domestic horse, whether that existed in North America whenever, 10,000, 50,000 years ago, what have you. So they looked at all the ancient DNA evidence and did a lot of additional work and interpretation. And although there's no question that all of the horses back in the Pleistocene were horses related to Equus caballus, there was no signal specifically for what we call the domestic horse. Now, why would that be? I just made this long, involved explanation for how horses arose. They got into Asia, they were domesticated. It's all one lineage in one sense, right? So, what happened? Well, evolution happened. This is the thing. We have to accept this. Evolution is always at work. And one way that you see the results of evolution is slow change in gene frequencies and in gene sequences. And what that's telling you is that natural selection is in operation, and that this is how we get species, that there's a gradual divergence over time among populations living in slightly different areas and therefore subject to slightly different selective pressures. So at the end of the day, what we can still say is that Equus cabellus's lineage is unquestionably North American, just like it is ultimately for all horses, but that over some appreciable period of time, there's been divergence. Now, I need to be clear about one thing. Nobody is questioning that the horses in North America were somehow radically different from Equus caballus. They're not. What we're talking about are the very slight changes that taxonomists look at when they're trying to come up with a detailed picture of the life that's present in a place at any one time. So the differences I'm talking about are not dramatic. In fact, they are so not dramatic. I still take the stance that if we could bring back a Pleistocene mare and pair that Pleistocene mare with a living stallion, they would probably still be able to get fertile living offspring. And that's one definition of a species. It's called the biological species concept. In general, it's very applicable, but in specific, you have a lot of problems, like the one I just mentioned. How can you possibly bring back a Pleistocene horse? Well, you can't. We may one day, with the way that ancient DNA is going, but that is not realistic at the moment. So just in summary, because I don't want to be confusing on this point, we don't have evidence that Equus caballus survived in North America for any length of time. And the important length of time here is for the arrival of the Europeans 500 years ago, bringing over their own horses. That was an idea. It's still adhered to by some people, that there were horses just like modern horses that managed to survive here. When the conquistadores and that lot came over, there was interbreeding. But the whole point of the Orlando study was to examine that proposition and see whether it could be resolved. And as far as I'm concerned, as a scientist, I say they resolved it. So sadly, we don't have the evidence for long survival of Equus caballus here up until the arrival of Europeans.
Well, and along that line, are horses a native species? I know J. Kirkpatrick had mentioned where it originated and whether or not it co-evolved with its habitat as the key elements. What's your definition of a native species?
It's a very fraught problem because nativeness can mean a lot of different things. At one point, I was very much in favor of arguing for horses, modern horses, being native on lineage grounds, just like I described. Whether or not the exact species was here, the lineage was here. And surely that's sufficient because their ecosystem is here. This is why horses do so well in Western North America. They are adapted to that ecosystem. So what are you telling me that there's no relationship between these horses and these lands such that we can deny them nativeness? I'm going to answer accordingly, Carol, your question in a different way, because there was a paper published only about a week and a half ago in the leading journal Science, which asked a very, very simple but very important question for us. with big herbivores like horses, like cattle, how do they actually differ from one another in terms of their traits with respect to the ecosystems that they live in? And by traits in this case, I would mean things like what plants do they prefer? What is their method of grazing? Uh, what is the potentiality for overgrazing? You can go on and on like that. And what they did was do what's called a meta-analysis. They took the results of well over 200 different studies of megaherbivores all over the world. This is not just North America, to see what the consistencies were and to see whether they could extract any meaningful propositions. And among those many propositions was, are cattle and horses really all that different? From a plant diversity, plant preservation, grassland preservation standpoint, they are not different. Now that's actually mind blowing because anybody who's been in the horse advocacy business knows that for years there's been the assertion that horses, because they are not native, do things different in such a way that they're continually eroding the landscape, continually destroying native plants. Just bad news in every direction. Whereas cattle, for some reason, don't. That's what's alleged. There are studies out there, some in high quality scientific journals, that report to show that there is such a difference. But this meta-analysis, the importance of which is that it combines so many different studies. It's not just one study, and it's looking for directionality in the statistical results. And what they found is that that difference does not exist in the way that people report that it does. Now, that does not mean, however, from any other standpoint, that horses and cattle are the same. Yes, they might be the same with respect to their impact on plant cover, but then you look at other traits to start asking other kinds of questions. What is the most suitable kind of big herbivores that we want, say, on public lands in the American West? So let's think about that. Cattle. Cattle get get fed off allotments that the BLM administers all over the West at very, very minimal prices. And what happens to those cattle? They get fattened up and then they get sold for slaughter. So they're transients. They come there, they feed, they're taken off, they don't stay. What I'm talking about with wild horses is that they are permanent residents. They're there for the long haul, and so are their bodies. They return to the soil. And a very important difference is in their physiology. Cattle are, 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 are fermenters that release a great deal of methane. Not their fault, it's the way it works. Their bacteria do that job. But hindgut fermenters like horses do not do that. They're not methanogenic. And for that reason, from a wider climate change kind of perspective, they're more beneficial when you look at it that way. Another thing that people look at is value. And value is not a nice word in this context because what we're talking about is that you can make $1 off cattle, you cannot make $1 off wild horses, not realistically anyway. That's true. And we have to accept that. As horse advocates, we have to accept the idea that different people they may even like horses, but they're not going to say that by virtue of what I was just saying about being methanogenic, that they should be taken off the land. In fact, quite the reverse. So how do we live with that? One way that we can live with that, I think, is to show in the best possible way how beneficial horses can be in grassland situations, particularly grassland situations which have been denuded thanks to overgrazing by cattle in this case, by agriculture. Now you would think, well, what's the problem with agriculture? The problem with agriculture is that it changes everything. You're going from a diverse plant cover filled with native species of many, many different kinds and going to monoculture. So there's one plant that dominates. That one plant is going to have its own microbiome. It's going to have its own associated microbes that do jobs for it or are related to it that will take over the soil. And those are not necessarily, in fact, quite clearly, are not always beneficial for the diversity of native plants that might have existed there previously. So, to the degree that we want to return American grasslands to what they were, not in detail, that's out of the question. It ain't the Pleistocene. What we can do is increase their health. And the measures of health are things like this. What's the retention of water on the surface of grasslands in places where you've had intensive overgrazing or that kind of agriculture? It's very often the case that it's like a sponge, it sinks in because the original kind of trust that existed in those places is gone. It can be regained. It's just a matter of having the right people there. And the right people in this case are things like horses and other mega herbivores. I'm thinking elk, I'm thinking mule deer. I'm even saying bison. Even though bison are basically cattle, they are one of our heritage species.
Mhm.
And they are another species that needs to be preserved in the best possible circumstances. So, what we envisage at Rewilding America now is demonstrating that this can be done. We have projects in the Dakotas and in Idaho in which we're going to demonstrate. This will take years, but we will demonstrate that by having mixed herds in quote, of bison and horses and allowing any other mega herbivores that are in the vicinity to show up and do their thing, that we will make a change, make a detectable change, and the measure of it will be diversity, water retention, other aspects of climate change like carbon sequestration. All of these are possible. All of these have been demonstrated to a greater or lesser degree by rewilding outfits in Europe. We can do it in this country, and that's what we stand for.
So, obviously, keeping wild horses on our public lands is important as well for the same reasons.
It is, but here we're going to be talking about other challenges. Most of the horse management areas are in places where really nobody wants to live. I'm thinking central Nevada, for example, which has a very large number of horse management areas.
Wyoming, same thing.
Yes, exactly. Now, what's the problem there? The problem there is these are very edge ecosystems. They're at the limits of the kind of plant cover, for example, that we would like to see, namely grasslands. They're too dry. The soils are not the best. And they are the kinds of places that you only in natural circumstances get a very, very few mega herbivores living at any one time. Because you can't make a living. It's as simple as that. People can't, nor can the herbivores. So by incarcerating them on these HMAs and then basically debiting them for being successful as a species by being so fecund that they get rounded up, you know, when the BLM decides by its algorithms that there's too many horses, for example, as everyone knows, they get shipped off to somewhere else to be warehoused at great expense to the taxpayer. Is this humane? Well, yes, because you're not absolutely shooting them or selling them for dog food as we used to. But what's the root problem? The root problem is placing them in these circumstances to begin with. What do you expect? If you leave them alone, they're all going to die out. Is that the idea? Is that the point of all of this, to manage horses to extinction? I have no solution except the following: that if Rewilding America Now and organizations like it are willing to put the time and money and effort into showing the American people that we can make a difference by using well explored, well verified techniques for improving grassland health, then that kind of restoration can be done in other places that are not privately owned or are public lands, to whatever degree BLM is willing to commit its resources to doing that. So instead of being always the bad guy, and if there's any BLM people out there, I want you to understand that I stand for cooperation. I don't stand for battling. If we can find common ground so that making these public lands available for multiple sources and uses, I'm all for that as well. It can't all be about horses and bison and whatnot. It has to be for multi-use. If we can do that, then the end result will be not only that we provide for the survival of a very important heritage species, the horse. Not only does it come to grips with at least minimally some aspects of climate change by improving the grasslands so they become better at carbon sequestration. Not only does it mean that water sources can be conserved in a way that they can't be now because of the arguments I was addressing earlier. The surface doesn't permit it. You get horses in there, you get beaver in places where beaver can make a living, you're going to change things very quickly. And anyone who has an interest in the natural world, whether or not you're a horse lover, if you have an interest in the natural world, you want to see as much of it as possible being taken into a form of protection where nature takes over, humans don't interfere, and it survives in the way that was always intended. Rather than going in and managing everything to death, let's talk about having circumstances where we don't have to do that. But it works out even better, which is my point.
Yes. And obviously, rangeland health has been a huge issue. And yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Um, and the BLM, of course, tends to blame wild horses for range degradation and has nothing to say about cattle or sheep on public lands, which really, with the numbers of cattle and sheep compared to the numbers of horses, you
Mhm.
really can't make a comparison on range damage without studying all of it. And unfortunately, the BLM is behind on their range measurements for degradation to range health on almost all of the HMAs right now. So we don't even have
Yes,
data on what's happened.
exactly. And I won't say this is the whole reason, but certainly part of the reason is that there's so much money wasted on the warehousing. There's there's so little outreach that I'm aware of, at least. So little in the way of outreach on the part of the BLM to people like us. We're not we're not necessarily enemies. What we should necessarily be all about is doing the best job we can for the most interests that we can. I'm not anti-cattle. Absolutely not. Cattle do a good job at what they're good for, which is to convert a lot of basically indigestible, high fiber plants into into meat that consumers can buy. And we don't do that. We don't farm horses in that way. And I would never recommend such a thing. But my point is that that is a realistic, meaningful occupation. And I don't want to denigrate it. What I do want is understanding that horses have their own benefit that they can confer on the land as ecosystem engineers, just like bison. And for that reason, there should be places, ample places, where horses can live. It's not a question of all of the one or all of the other. It doesn't all have to be about cattle, and it certainly doesn't have to be all about horses. Find a middle ground, and that requires compromise. If come to conclusions and methodologies that work for the best benefits that you can accrue, and just live with the fact that we're living in a place where we have to cooperate if we expect to survive. It's really all the same thing.
Um, Anything else you can think of that might be important to let people know?
Well, the ancient DNA studies, which I've been an incidental part of, are still continuing. I'm not sure we're going to quickly resolve the question of whether there was any kind of lengthy survival of horses anywhere in North America. And there's two good reasons for this. One is that the DNA that I'm talking about that's evidence for late survival in Yukon, this doesn't come from bones and teeth. It comes directly from the soil. It turns out that even though the DNA molecule is fairly weakly constructed and rapidly falls apart, it falls apart into pieces. And DNA techniques have advanced so greatly that it's possible to take these pieces and kind of tile them together so you can recreate lengthy sequences like you would be able to do with bones and teeth. And that's a just a huge improvement in terms of what we can do in terms of collecting evidence. So my point here is that that's all we've got at the present. We have what's called environmental DNA, the DNA coming from the soil. It gives us a signal that an equid of some sort was around. But because it's the evidence, the sequence evidence, as we call it, is so limited, we can do nothing more than that. We can't say it's Equus caballus or Equus lambi or this, that, and the next thing. It's beyond the range of possibility. But over time, it may be that we are able to do precisely that. And then we'll have a much better idea of who was persistent. And there's every possibility if they lasted until 6,000, they could have lasted till 2,000, and maybe even much later, somewhere. Obviously, in very small populations, otherwise they would have been seen. They would have been hunted by first Americans as well as Europeans when they came along. We don't have evidence of that, and it's unlikely that that's the case. But some late survival is certainly not out of the question. Whether it means anything for this debate that we've been talking about today, I don't think it will, because they won't be very probably close at all to Equus caballus. So the same kind of issue about nativeness, non-nativeness won't be resolved. But I think from my earlier comments, what I'm saying is that it doesn't need to be resolved, because horses are horses. Horses grew up and co-evolved with grasslands all over the world. And by reinstalling them here in numbers, which is another thing we can talk about, the numbers of horses that we need, by reinstalling them so that they can do their job on the grasslands along with bison, along with other mega herbivores, over time will make a difference. That's a certainty. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but if you continue the program and you pay attention to the variables that you need to pay attention to, then that's an outcome that's conceivable. And then we needn't have this kind of bickering over whether horses belong or whether horses are more erosive or any of this. All of it is practically meaningless in light of this new study, because they're saying that the large-bodied herbivores are going to have an impact. But one of those impacts, and this is another thing, one of those impacts that they demonstrated from this meta-analysis is that there's a net positive if you've got mega herbivores around, really big herbivores like horses, in terms of the species diversity, which you don't get if you're dealing with much smaller herbivores, so, say down to rabbit size, if you want to consider them herbivores, which they certainly are. What they can't do is what the big guys can do, which is eat everything. And especially in the case of horses, because they're hindgut fermenters, you get very quick pass through. So seeds survive. And because horses are so mobile, it means that the seeds get distributed all over the place. Another benefit that only a mega herbivore can provide. So why not? Let's do it.
And obviously, the sooner we get started with this, the better, given
Exactly.
given climate change and given that things are getting drier and hotter. And much better to start now.
Yes, it is. And I'm hoping that the example of Rewilding America now is going to be adopted by other organizations that have the funds. Let's face it, it's funding intensive, but with a common purpose that we're trying to make a difference and demonstrate that difference to our fellow citizens, that this is worth doing because the benefits will be there. And consider the alternative. If you don't have the mega herbivores doing their job like seed dispersal, what do you expect? Our native plant species are going to have smaller and smaller ranges. There's going to be wider and wider areas of denudation, not only because of that, but also because of climate change.
Yes,
You need all the water you can get in these places.
yes.
So think in rewilding terms of how these ecosystems could function if the proper placeholders were there, the ones that do these jobs that we've taken away. It would be marvelous.
And we have so many millions of acres of public land that would be perfect to do this.
Yes. Yes, and one of the things we haven't even talked about was the ecosystem, the ecotourism value.
Yes,
People love watching horses. It doesn't matter whether you ride them or whether you just want to look or what have you. They're among our most charismatic species on this continent. And having horses in lots of places where people can enjoy them would be another huge benefit. This is demonstrated, by the way, in Europe, where our sister organization, Rewilding Europe, has been at this job for decades now. And because of the density of population there and the actual lack of wide open spaces, people love to be able to get out of their cities and even go to a small tract where rewilding has taken place, where you can see species that you would never ordinarily see. And I'm talking farm animals. I'm talking mostly domesticants in the case of Europe. People love to see sheep doing their thing as well as the horses and the cattle and so on, because we're part of it. This is why it's so appealing. It makes you human to see landscapes where other species are living as well. It doesn't isolate us like we are to such a great degree in cities, where the only other animal you ever see that's a mammal or our size would be a couple kinds of domesticants, namely dogs and cats, and that's about it. Just the opportunity to see other life forms living, creating environments for themselves. It's a wonderful thing to see, and we can
yes,
do
it
it.
is. Yes, it is. And people here in the United States, they love to go see wild horses. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which, if I could be just quasi political for a moment, I'm not going to be very political, but the Teddy Roosevelt National Park is in the never-ending process. I don't know why they can't just make up their bloody minds and get it over with. Whether they're going to remove roughly 200 horses that have been there in one sense or another, not necessarily the same herd or the same lineage, for a very long period of time. And one of the arguments is the same one that we've been talking about, that horses are destructive. So you want them out of there because this is a national park. You only want native species. Well, guess what? People go to TRNP just to see horses
Absolutely.
because you can. And that's the point, because you can. Whereas you can't elsewhere. So why remove that pleasure from people for a species that actually is doing its job in what grasslands exists there,
Yes.
and allow people to understand what the function of these mega herbivores is in the environments in which they live. Which it's another thing that most people, if I ask the question, what's a mega herbivore, they would say, I have no idea. It sounds like big. Yes, it is big, but mega herbivores are ones that are in the 1,000 pound range. They are important just because of the volume of plant matter that they consume every day, pass through their guts, return it to the soil along with the seeds and all the rest of it, which is what the grasslands require. That they need to be kept up to a high level of diversity thanks to the presence of these mobile organisms called mammals that can consume their seeds without destroying them and take them out to other areas. If you're the kind of plant that doesn't really have much in the way of a dispersal mechanism, you are desperate for having to make a herbivore in the vicinity because they do the job. And by virtue of having horses and bison, I would argue as well, in TRNP, you have the beginning of a conversation that you can have with people, why this is important and what can be done. The new presidential library for Teddy is going up in Medona. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's going to be just a magnificent building.
Wow.
Can't even see the building because it's going to have it's going to have a bio cover, grassland, by the way, over the top of it. And
Wow.
what a perfect place to talk about horses, or talk about the heritage of horses, talk about horses and Teddy, and so on and so on, to get people not to go back in time in any real way, but to understand that ecosystems are long-term structures. And if you want to preserve them, you can't kill them. And by doing things over vast parts of this country, that's what we've done. We've made it very difficult for all kinds of ecosystems to survive in the way that they did. And this is not just a matter of removing important species, the keystone species. That's, of course, a big part of it. But it's everything else. It's the pollution. It's the utilization for mining, for example, of big areas, strip mining. If you take everything away, then it can't possibly exist. So think about it. What are the least invasive, least problematic things we can do and still make money off our natural resources? Again, I'm not against any of this. I just think it needs to be done in a logical and rational manner so that most stakeholders get most of what they want.
And with an eye on the future to preserving.
With a total eye on the future.
Well, thank you so much for coming on uh, my podcast to talk about this. And I'll have a link to Rewilding America Now so that you can find out more information
Thank you.
about it. And thank you again.
You are most welcome, Carol.